that everyone already figured out, right? I think in the anime, talk about it first. I think in the anime it is much more clear, just from the voice alone. Like it's the voice acting, what makes it more clear. I think at the end of the last episode also made it more clear because kind of ended on facing Eren there. So it was like, here's Eren, it's clearly Eren, and so on, right? And then we have this in here, and he's like, oh, it's my name is Kruger, like of course his father, right? And the Attack Titan and so on. So we know what the name Kruger makes sense, right? So it's all of that made it more clear. And one thing though, which I want to say at first, is that it's also the pacing, I believe, the pacing itself, right? Because they have clearly cut a lot of content here. You can argue if it's good or bad, but they have cut a lot of content from the manga during these episodes until the Eren reveal. So if you actually read the manga for this part, the manga took a lot longer time to actually reveal it was Eren, right? Because in the manga, it was more flashback, it was more on Bernholt, it was more on Annie, it was more on Marcel. The Ymir, she didn't get much more flashback. It was a little bit of Ymir in the manga, not much more than anime, basically nothing. And more Gabby, more Falco and so on, right? So they had, Raina's mom and so on, right? Miss Brown and so on. So they had more on that stuff, right? And was less of these Mr. Kruger scenes. So in the manga, it's a lot more like, that's probably Eren, but he's kind of actually there on the side, and they spend so much more time with other characters. So people had time to kind of, theorize this was Eren for a long time, right? Here in the anime, they kind of removed half the chapters. They kind of cut away half the content, right? And a lot more Eren, and he was kind of, it's Eren. So, I feel it was, I think honestly, less impactful here in the anime. A lot actually less impactful. Because in the manga then it was built up a lot more subtle, right? It took a longer time. And then it was, everyone probably, I feel, guessed it was Eren anyway in the manga, right? But it wasn't as clear, and there was definitely a lot more other storylines happening on the sideline before we got to Eren. But the problem, though, of course, with these chapters here, that was the anime, the 4 episodes adopted, is that in the manga, that was, again, a lot slower pacing, right? A lot more stuff there. And I think, or at least in my knowledge and so on, I think this is very true, is that it was the least popular chapters ever in the manga. Like the whole, here's Gabby, she's the main character now. It's a lot more than the manga, right? Gabby and Rainer so being focused on Falcos a bit. So that part of the manga was very unpopular. Not just because Gabby is Gabby, but generally, I mean, it was like the episode 1 here had Jean, right? My favorite character, right? My absolute favorite character. I love Jean, right? I love Jean so much. I think he's by far the best written character. By far the best written character. So they showed Jean in episode 1, and I was like, Jean, my boy Jean, right? So they showed Jean, for example, in episode 1. In the manga, you didn't see Jean until like chapter 10 or whatever. Yeah, Jean is supposed to appear until like way later, right? So they've clearly, I think they clearly known here that they have to they redid it, right? Cut away half the storyline and was like, let's show Eren a lot more focused, so people won't be like, where's Eren? Because in the manga it was like literally like months, right? Like 5, 6, 7 months, I don't know, like 10 months without Eren, or at least something like that, so more than that, and Jean and so on. So it's very, very different. It's very, very different, because it's a monthly manga, right? And they didn't do it. I can't remember exactly now that I don't remember exactly, but it's probably something like 5, 6 chapters until you see Kruger, and then it's a lot less obvious that it's Eren in the manga. So it was probably like a long bit in there until that scene with Eren and then Tybur and so way later. So that's interesting. I pointed out from a different aspect here. Because as I said episode 1 in my episode 1 review, I really feel that it's pretty clear that this is honestly exactly, I would say, what I expected, right? They will cut away so much content of the Marleys and just go back to Eren again, right? Because I should say no one, but it was very unpopular. The only part wasn't very popular. He's like, oh, Eren, you like Eren? Come on, Eren's your favorite character. It's kind of like that. But anyway, let's review. I just want to say this first. I think I have a very interesting difference here. And honestly, if I may be like that, right? Well, as I called it, right? I called it that they were gonna cut away so much content from the Mali side, right? Because it wasn't very popular, and it was just kind of strange how much it was on like Rainer and Gabi, so there's so much on them in the manga. So here is a lot more condensed, right, into back to Eren. But anyway, let's talk about this in here. I think it's a great scene, right? We have Grandpa, I'm covering his face of cast, but yeah, Grandpa, of course. Grandpa Jaeger, right? Oh, I say Jaeger for some reason, speaking English, but Jäger. It's a German name or a Swedish name, right? So it's pronounced Jag, the A sound, right? So it's Jägare in Swedish. And in German it's like Jägare. So yeah, which means hunter for that matter, if anyone cares. So it kind of fits into the Attack Titan, right? Yeah, he's a Attack Titan, right? So yeah, Jäger means hunter, right? Kruger, also a very German name, or something else. It's a bird. But anyway, so this is of course Grisa's father, right? And of course Eren's grandpa. So I think this is probably my favorite scene, ignoring all the Gabi stuff, because yeah, it's interesting scene here. He meets his grandpa, and it felt like grandpa. It's a very interesting scene. Of course, it's never been explained what it means, right? But it feels like grandpa in this scene is kinda aware that it is his grandson, or he looks like his son, right? And he's like getting, talking to Eren, and he's like, hey boy, you remind me of my son, this doctor Grisha that I kind of threw out because he's killed his sister and he turned crazy and joined the rebels, and I didn't want to be a rebel. I loved it, more or less, right? Because of course, remember his father, or Grisha's father, or Eren's grandpa then, right? Grandpa Yisan here. He was, of course, a Marley, what do you call it? I don't know, Marley supporter or whatever. Yeah, he liked the Mars. He wanted to be with the Mars. He didn't want to, betray them or join the paradise. All right. So he, of course, blamed his son, right, for his daughter's death, which is arguably his son's fault. Indirectly, of course, he was. That is true, though. I mean, obviously, Grisha did not kill his sister, but he clearly took his sister outside the restriction or whatever, right? Indirectly caused her death. It's true, though, right? But anyway, so that happened, and then of course, he went into hating his son, right? And then he raised his Mystique, and then made his grandson, and kind of raised him instead. And then I guess he lost it afterwards and went crazy, and they put him into this what's called mental hospital. Hispa, I would call it hospice. Hispan. What is it in German? I think it's something similar in German. Because in Swedish it's called it's like a slang for it, but you usually call it hispan or something when you throw your grandpa into kind of a mental place. Hospice in English. So I think it's something similar in German too, if I remember correctly. Something like that. But I mean, obviously, as I talked about earlier in many interviews, of course, it's very German, World War II, I think, and so on, right? Of course, the names Jäger is a German or Swedish name and so on, right? And Kruger and also a German and Swedish name and so on. But anyway, yeah. So it's a hispan, I would call it, and I think it's interesting because it feels like he is kind of getting a clear vision, right? Which probably means that he does recognize that Eren looks a lot like his father. Like a lot. Like there's probably a thing there. And the thing is that, and as I mentioned earlier here, when you read this, of course I'm doing like comparison here, anime manga review here, but when you read this chapter, it was much more interesting, honestly, in my opinion, because it wasn't as clear. This was Eren. It wasn't as obvious. So when you had it in the manga, you were like, why would Grandpa Jäger? Why would he know this is Eren? Yeah, it was much more clear. He was like, wait a minute. Why is Grandpa Eren, or sorry, Eren's grandpa, so into Mr. Kruger? It has to be Eren, right? So yeah, in the manga, it's a lot more like, well, that is clearly Eren then, based on being grandpa and so on. Here, I felt, watching the anime, I think a lot of people are probably going to be like, well, he's clearly recognized that he's grandson, right? So I think it's constantly a different perspective there. I don't know, but you guys need to comment below. Yeah, it's kind of like, But anyway, it's a good scene. And, then we go into, of course, a lot of Gabi-licious episode. I like when Gabi, that's it, I love them. I'm doing it for you, Gabi! And even the guards are like, come on, man, he likes you. And Gabi's like, why would you do it if you like me? Stop. Yeah, That's Gabby Lisher. I love that scene. You know, Gabby is so perfect at everything except just basic common sense, right? I mean, it's so clear that poor Franco likes her, and she's like, "Why would you do it if he likes me? I don't understand." And everyone's like, "Oh, god damn it, Gabby, god damn it." That was beautiful. And of course, I mentioned earlier, Love and Rainer was like having to pay for pizza, ice cream, and so on. That's a good part. And otherwise, good episode now introduces Japan or Hirusen or Van or whatever, right? So introducing Japan. I don't know. One guy is clearly like a Turkish, like clearly some kind of. I mean, the anime is taking place roughly, as I mentioned earlier, like World War II, to World War One, in the middle, kind of in the 30 or 20 side, something like that, right? So maybe somewhere around, like the revolution in Turkey and so on. So you kind of see the clothing there looks kind of like the clothing the Turkish man had, I would probably date it something like 1918, 1919, right? In that clothing. The woman is wearing like a classic Japanese kimono, so that's kind of like still used today in Japan, so a little bit hard to date, right? But it's basically that, of course, this episode here shows that the Mali has all the other countries, right, as their allies or potentially their enemies, right, from different empires or countries, and it's kind of like the clothing is roughly 1920s or maybe a little. It depends. It's a little random, right? But it's kind of like supposed to be early 20th century, right? World War One, World War Two, kind of in the some mixture of that, right? But it's interesting though. Even if the episode doesn't really explain that, oh, this guy is in this country and from that country, the episode still kind of clearly points out that, well, here's a lot of this stuff, right? Like, it clearly is basically our world, and they have all these different countries and so on. One thing, though, which they actually focus more on a little bit is how the Marley are fighting. Maybe that's coming from my love for, like, tactical role-playing games, like FFT and these kind of games, and, like, Fire Emblem and so on, right? But I love those storylines where they're like, oh, here's the military of Marley, this many guys, this guy, yeah. I would like a little bit where if they actually explain, like, here's Marley, right? And down here is like Hisarud, and down here is like this country, and they have these armies, and this and this. They don't have to focus that much on that, but a little bit like a world building of the armies and military powers and allies and this thing and enemies and rivals and pacts and so on. I think because if you look at my historic aspect, I mentioned earlier during the reaction part, I have spent most this Christmas weekend here now watching, not most, but a lot of it, watching a lot of historical documentaries, right, with my family, because, man, they watched a lot of historical documentaries with my family. As I mentioned earlier, in the reaction, my grandfather was a history professor as well, and a math professor. So it's kind of a thing there, and I'm into that as well and so on. So I don't know, but when I look at the Marleys, it's obviously World War One and World War Two, right? I would love a little bit of, like, let's just talk about all the military powers and the technology and the alliance, and so I would like that, but maybe that's just me, right? But I would like a little bit. It doesn't have to be actually super important. It's like a few minutes of, like, explaining the world and all the different pacts and the facets. Because one thing then, from a historical aspect, the anime is obviously fiction, but it's based on, like, World War One and Two, right? A huge thing in history is that the reason why this turned into a World War One, right, is that Austria, at the time then, were allied with everyone, or enemy with everyone. Basically, the Sarajevo thing, right, turned into Austria going into war. Austria-Hungary, I would say exactly, but Austria is in the union with Hungary, and they go into war. And when they enter the war, right, they have, like, so many allies, and the other countries have so many allies too. So that's why World War One started, right? Because when this country entered war in Austria, then they entered the war, and they had like 40 allies, and then the other allies, and everyone suddenly in the war right there. So that's kind of the reason why, right? Because at the time in history, it was so many. Oh, this guy is married to that guy, and that's his cousin, and that thing, and that thing, and that thing, right? And everyone is so connected, and it feels like in the Tybur scene, when he's introducing, he's a friend with this guy, and Tybur is this guy, and this woman, and so on. It feels like they're setting up, in my opinion at least. And again, remember here, I mentioned that earlier, Tybur, right? Tybur, I guess. I probably pronounce his name is like Tybur or like Tibar or something like that. Anyway, he's clearly supposed to be somehow like, German or maybe Swedish or whatever, right? And again, then Austria was in the power of the Holy Roman Empire before this thing then. So Austria was actually the German power state, not actually Germany. That didn't exist before that. So in history then, quick lesson here, right? In history, in the past, Germany didn't exist. Instead, you had different princes, different crown princes, and like what are called elective princes. Yeah. In the whole Roman Empire, that was primarily controlled by Austria. So Austria then, right, had all this power, right, mainly with personal unions and marriage and voting and so on in this German like city-state combination, right? And the scene there with Tybur, when he is like, hey my bro, hey my girl, that kind of thing, that's a very, in my opinion, it feels like a very like an Austria court thing, right? An Austria royal court, when he's like, yeah, I'm friends with everyone, and I got all these allies and all these pacts and all my cousins and family. Yeah, it's a lot of feeling like, I think so at least, in my opinion, from a historical aspect, that scene to me is a lot like an Austria royal court scene, right? Much more than the German royal court scene. That would then lead into, of course, World War One, right? And again, as I mentioned earlier, he looks, of course, very Scandinavian more than German, but still, German, etc. If I shave my beard, I would probably look a lot like him. Blonde, blue eyes, long blonde hair. I always look very similar, generally, to him as a character, right? And of course, Kruger and Jäger and so on. Yeah, it's very German, Austria, and so on. So that's what I think more, I suppose. So that's for me a historical guy, right? As a history buff. At the time of World War One, the important country, well, of course Germany was very important too. It was much more like Austria was the big player in the beginning, yeah, and of course also German language country, right? And before that, Austria was a lot more bigger than Germany. Massively. I mean, Germany exists, so yeah. Austria was the power player of the German people, right? Which are obviously the Marlies. So yeah, if you haven't gotten to that, I said every time, but obviously the Marlies are Germans. Like, come on. So it's but as a side note, from a historical aspect there, right? I think it's important to think about that I would say that Tybur is supposed to be Austrian German, right? Like German people, right? All this Germany, but you also have, Swiss, and you have other countries too, like we had Böhmen and so on, right? So also German people at the time, right? So so after that, so I think more like that. In my opinion, I would put him as like an Austrian royal crown prince, right? Like an elected prince of Austria. Is probably I would put Tybur more than being like a German, like a big count of Germany. Whatever. I put it more in Austria. But anyway, historical buff there. Yeah, I'm broken because I watched so much documentaries too. I was like, God damn it, my head. Anyway, that's kind of interesting point here. And as I mentioned earlier too, I think again the Ishiyama, right? He loves the Scandinavian, the Norse mythology, and the German thing, right? Because the story of the heroic thing that slay the giant and this thing, right? It is very similar to like Siegfried and other German myths, right? And also Scandinavian myths, right? Norse mythology myths with this kind of hero and the name, and even the statue is similar to a statue in not my hometown, but in the city next to my hometown, and so on. It's very, very similar to that. And of course, I always say, right? When you look at the 9 Titans. Why is it 9 Titans? I say it every time because there are 9 worlds in Norse mythology, right? It's 9 worlds of mythology. Why is it? They have 1 power each. Every power is supposed to represent, right? Of course, the planes of, the Yggdrasil, and you have the 9 different worlds now that it connects, and have the pathing. It is clearly that Titan is based a lot about Norse mythology, right? So there's no surprise to me that the Tybur family heroic Marley story, even the statue itself, looks to me at least incredibly Norse mythology, Scandinavian, and also Germany, then mostly North Germany. And like it's literally a statue in my hometown, or not hometown, next to my hometown, that is almost exactly the same, right? But instead of being a giant, it's a dragon, right? Instead of being a giant head, right? It's a dragon head. But it's incredibly similar to that. So you can find the statues in Germany and Sweden and so on is very, very similar to the statue in this episode. I think that's very important to think about. Or very important, but I mean, I think the reference, right, is very clear there, and combined again with the North 9 world and so on, right. I think it's a lot of Ishiyama taking a lot from that, from like North mythology and so on. So if you want to do that for them, I said that a few years ago, but I think it's pretty clear that if you want to do theory crafting, right, on Attack on Titan, I will look into a lot of North mythology and see like where would this go from similar stories, like generally the Jutuns, like the giants, Jutun or Juttar, and so on, right? And Asir and Isir and all that stuff, right? It's very, very similar. And of course Yggdrasil and stuff like that, and the path thing, yeah, it's very, very similar. So if you want to do some smart video like that, yeah, you'll be like, well, I look at the Norse mythology. But that's what I think about the hero story. And more seriously, there's a statue. I saw it last year. It's incredibly similar to that statue. I mean, that's the same statue. It's the same. You replace the giant head with the dragon head. It's the same thing, right? It's a pretty classic core statue with like a hero. But even the clothes are the same thing, because the clothes are kind of that classic heroic clothing. It's like a mixture of that kind of like the, I guess like the medieval clothing style, yeah, like 1100, 1000 around there, 10th, 11th century clothing style and so on. But anyway, guys, that's yeah, I history buff here, but I felt that it's very similar, right? To I see him as the Austrian royal courting, and it's interesting to think about from history aspect. I think it is be history buff, but if you think about it, this anime is taking place in a fictional version of World War One, kind of ish, right? And at that time, then before the war starts, right, especially 1500s before the war starts, Austria is the power player, not Germany, which didn't even exist before a few hundred years ago. So it's like, I think it's more relevant to look at him as an Austrian royal court than a German royal court, which I think most people doesn't really matter so much. But to me, it matters a lot, from historic aspect. But anyway, guys, that's the Titan. I'm Terje, and I'll see you guys tomorrow with